Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Dear students and friends, Assalamu alaikum. My name is Sayyid Muhammad Ali Abbas, and I will be giving you a series of introductory lectures in economics. We will have 45 lectures in all, 1 hour each, split evenly between microeconomics and macroeconomics in number. Those of you who do not understand what microeconomics and macroeconomics is, be patient and I'll explain in detail what these terms mean. This course has been designed for two types of students. Those who wish to pursue economics further on, like it as a career, or those who just want to get a taste of economics and are going to major in subjects like computer science or some other subject. Let's now see what the course content or the reading material that we'll be relying on is. The main part of the course material, my friends, will be the lecture handouts that I distribute to you. Now, these lecture handouts will be graphs and illustration intensive. We will make a lot of use of graphs. These are supposed to make life easier for you, not difficult for you. And I expect that you will go through the lecture handouts in great detail and then connect it with the material that is covered in the lecture. Now, the main text that I have chosen for you for this course is the book by David Begg, Stanley Fischer, and Rudiger Dornbusch, which is titled Economics. And this is the 6th edition of the book that I have chosen. This is a year 2000 edition. I think there is a 7th edition also available in the market. So if you would like to follow that, that's fine by me. But this is the edition that I have based most of the lectures on. Note that this is not the only text that I have consulted in preparing the lecture handouts. The lecture handouts are far more comprehensive and have a lot of material from some other books as well. So I've consulted books like John Sloman's Economics, Joseph Stiglitz's Economics, and if you get your hands on those books, it will be very helpful for you because a lot of the material in the notes is also benefiting from the material included in those textbooks. That said, the book by David Begg, Stanley Fischer, and Rudiger Dornbusch is quite a comprehensive treatment of the subject at an introductory level. We have the advantage that David Begg is a UK economist, and then we have representation from the US in terms of Stanley Fischer and Rudiger Dornbusch. So we get a nice mix of views from both Europe and the United States, and this makes the treatment of the subject more comprehensive than if we had selected a book which was either written by a UK economist or a US economist or some other economist, either from Pakistan or some other country. Now, the other book that I think will be of use to you is the Schaum series outline, which is the Principles of Economics 2nd edition book. Now, this is a very powerful book in the sense that it has a number of questions, solved questions that you can go through. You can look at the different steps that are included in this book, and I think this will be extremely helpful for you in preparation for exams, because really you do need to do a lot of practice of the different mathematical questions, the different graphical questions, and the Schaum series book, Principles of Economics, is ideal for that purposes. So if you supplement your reading of the main text, that is Economics by David Begg and Fischer and Dornbusch, with a study of Principles of Economics, it will give you a solid command of the subject. Now, for your convenience, I've mentioned exactly in my lecture notes which chapters in these two books correspond to the material being covered in any particular lecture. So if, let's say, my lecture 1 is based on chapter 3 in the David Begg book and chapter 4 in the Principles of Economics book, then I've mentioned that at the end of the lecture handout for your convenience. The third book that I would suggest all of you to at least consult is the Issues in Pakistan's Economy book by Syed Akbar Zaidi. Zaidi Saab is a Pakistani economist, Karachi-based. This book has been published by Oxford University Press. It's a very good and comprehensive introduction to the issues that Pakistan has faced in the last 50 years, the economic issues. You will not be tested on the material included in this book. but it's always useful to know more about one's own economy. So it would be useful to consult this book after you've completed this course or during the course at any time you want to see how the concepts that you've learned applied in Pakistan's case or in the particular case of the Pakistani economy. So those were the texts that I think would be useful for you for this course. If there are additional texts that you want to consult, you're most welcome to do that and can only strengthen your understanding of economics. Finally, we'll have online questions that we've designed for you. The important thing to note about these questions is that you can go online, there'll be multiple choice in multiple choice format, and when you click a particular like A, B, or C, you won't get a prompt of, yes, this is the right answer, or no, this is the wrong answer. But we've tried to read your mind and put something down as to why that particular answer is wrong and why a particular answer is right. The first point to note about how we should approach economics is that economics is a social science. It is not a natural science like physics, chemistry, or biology. And I'm sure all of you have been exposed to at least one of those three natural sciences in your A-levels or intermediate level sort of courses. Economics is a social science. Other examples of social science are anthropology, sociology, political science is also an example. So what is the main difference between social sciences and natural sciences? There are two main differences. The first main difference is that in social sciences, you do not have the luxury of controlled experiments. Let me give you an example. For example, if you are a physics student and if you want to study the impact of temperature on the movements of a particle, and you want to control for all other factors like air resistance or the effect of other particles, it is possible to design a laboratory environment in which you can sort of create a vacuumed environment, suck all of the particles out, and then you can study exclusively the impact of temperature on that one particle's behavior. And an analogy of this in economics would be, let's say, that you wanted to study the impact of the inflation rate on the exchange rate. Now, is it possible for you to control for all other factors that are influencing the exchange rate? For example, there could be external shocks, there could be domestic shocks. The exchange rate responds to a number of variables. And all of those variables are at play simultaneously. But unlike what you did in physics, you cannot create a laboratory environment in which you can control for all other forces and focus exclusively on the link between two variables. So this is at the heart of the study of social sciences. The other major difference about the study of social sciences, like economics, is that they involve a study of human behavior. And human behavior, which is driven by the human mind, is in some ways like a black box. You can never fully unravel what happens inside the black box, right? Why a certain person behaves in a certain way is very different from why a particle or a heavenly body or a chemical behaves in a certain way. The implication of this is that any characterization of human behavior in economics or any other social science is likely to be, or at best going to be, an approximation to reality. It can be a good approximation or a bad approximation, but it will be an approximation. Now, the implication of these two major differences, the fact that you don't have the facility of controlled experiments, and that you are studying human decision-making processes, which cannot be accurately or 100% accurately depicted, is that economic theories or economic models can be challenged. They are not like the laws of physics. They have subjective reasoning embedded in them. And the implication of this, in turn, is that we need to differentiate between two different types of statements in economics. We need to know what normative statements are and what positive statements are. Positive statements are statements of fact which can be verified empirically. So one example of a positive statement would be that unemployment is rising. Now, this statement can be tested. I mean, the correctness or incorrectness of this statement can be tested. by collecting the unemployment data on, let's say, the 4 provinces of Pakistan, aggregating them together, and seeing whether unemployment is higher this year than last year. It can be tested. This is a positive statement. An example of a normative statement would be that it is right to tax the rich people more than the poor people, or that the government should reduce inflation. Now, neither of these statements can be empirically tested. They are value judgments. They involve a notion of what a person considers desirable in an ideal realm, that this should be or this shouldn't be. So it's very important to understand the difference between normative and positive statements. Often in economic literature, people misconstrue normative statements as positive statements, whereas in actuality they relate to some should-be notion of reality. Now, given this background about normative, positive, about economics being a social science, we can stab into 2 very basic but very important questions about economics. The first one is very obvious: how to define economics. We've mentioned that economics is a social science, but remember that we still haven't quite defined the subject. And the second one is, why should we study economics? What is there about economics that all of us must be concerned about? Let me try and answer the second question first, and then we'll move to the definition. To answer the question why we should study economics, one should first of all note that the information of the knowledge of basic economic principles and issues is essential for any well-behaved, well-informed and responsible citizen of society. Our newspapers and news channels are filled with information about economic issues like unemployment, like inflation, prices, why the exchange rate is depreciating or appreciating, why certain firms are exercising monopoly power in a certain industry, poverty. And so without a basic knowledge of economics, it is practically impossible to develop an understanding of these issues and form sensible opinions about it. Right. So given that we've established the need for studying economics, let's now try to define it. Economics can be defined as the study of how we, the people, both in our individual and collective capacities, engage in the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services in a society. That's the broadly agreed upon definition of economics. Now, if you listened carefully, there are 6 different and important terms in that definition. For example, there was we the people, which might seem the easiest of those terms. In fact, it is the most difficult one. Then there was consumption, production, and distribution. Actually, it was in the reverse order, but that's okay. And then there was goods and services. So let's try to understand what these terms mean. Let's start in the reverse order. Goods and services. What are goods and services? A good is any item, anything which you can place a finger on. So, for example, televisions, computers, books, food, flowers, anything which you can put a finger on, which can be produced, sold, bought, and consumed, is a good. Now, the nature of production and consumption can vary. For example, when you consume television, you consume it by watching it. When you consume a flower, you consume it by smelling it. When you consume food, you consume food by eating it. But those are all examples of consumption of goods. They're all goods. You can touch them physically. Services, on the other hand, are a more difficult beast to grasp. Think of service as a haircut. That's one example of a service. So the barber who gives you the haircut is the person supplying the service to you. And you, the person whose hair is being cut, is the recipient of that service. So he gets the money for supplying the service, and you pay him the money for receiving the service. So that's an example of service. Now, in order to understand the other 4 terms which are left, which is consumption, production, distribution, and we the people, let's turn to our slide. As we can see, we can be divided into 3 broad groups. We the people, that is. So we can be individuals or households, we can be firms involved in production, or we can be a part of government. And the government has a role in the distribution and allocation of goods and services, and we will see this shortly. Let's first look at how we behave as individuals and households. Now, as individuals and households, we are involved in consumption of goods and services. So we generate the demand for the goods and services which are produced by firms in our society. Right? So the firms produce televisions, computers, vegetables, a lot of other stuff, services as well, haircuts, shoe polishing, and we households generate the demand for those services. Now let's look at firms. Firms are a more complex concept because it is not, the concept of the firm is not the same as a big factory and with a lot of machinery and plants and a lot of people working there. That is indeed one type of firm. In economics, a firm can be a one-person enterprise as well. So while we have, let's say, a large car manufacturing plant, car manufacturing facility, that would also be an example of a firm. But similarly, we could have a person who polishes shoes and goes around streets in search of consumers looking for shoes to be polished. He is also an example of a firm. A person who sells ice cream is also an example of a firm. So firm is anything in which there is a production or a supply of a service or a good, right? Now, it's natural to see that individual or household demand for goods and services will be unlimited. There is no limit to how much we can demand of a particular good. So, for example, one person might have a house. He might want another house. A person who has two houses might want a third house. A person who has a mansion or has a number of mansions might want more. So human wants are unlimited. So in that sense, there is no limit to how much consumers can demand of goods and services. And that's why you see the word unlimited next to the word demand. However, now let's look at the supply side of goods and services. And you can see the word limited there. Is it possible for firms to produce an unlimited quantity of goods in an economy? Think about it. Is it? No, it is not. Why? It is not possible because the factors of production are limited. So what are the different factors of production? As you can see, there are four main factors of production. The things which are used to produce goods and services, that firms use to produce goods and services. You obviously have land, you have labor, you have capital, and you have entrepreneurship. Let's try to understand what these terms mean and why are they scarce? Why are they not unlimited? Let's take a look at land first. Land is obviously limited. The area of a country is limited. But more importantly, the area of, let's say, if you're producing a crop, then the utilizable area, the area on which crops can be grown, is often limited. Then think about raw materials in a country. The stock of raw materials in a country is limited. So the natural resources of a country per se, and land in particular, are limited. So that's one factor of production whose limited quantity we've established. The next one is labor. Labor is actually an example of human resources. So your human resource, which would basically be your labor force, is limited both in quantity and in skill. So a person has, there are a limited number of people in an economy to work. You can't exceed the number of people who offer themselves to be on the labor force, right? Then the people who do offer themselves to work on the labor force have limited skills. They can't work beyond a certain level of ability. They can't work beyond a certain number of hours. That would actually come as part of the labor supply being limited. But so the skill and the quantity of labor that can be supplied are both limited. The third one is capital. And with capital, you don't necessarily mean money. money does not directly go into the production of goods and services. Money is paper. So paper doesn't go directly into the production of goods and services. By capital, you mean any type of machinery. So you have plants, machines, distribution networks, all these things would be taken as capital. Buildings, anything which is constructed to facilitate the production of goods and services. And you can well imagine that the stock of capital in any country would be limited, because you can only build so many buildings in a country, you can only build so many plants in a building, you can only have so many machines in that plant. So the stock of capital is also limited. Finally, entrepreneurship. This is a more difficult concept to grasp. Entrepreneurship is the managerial ability, the management skills that the owner of the firm brings to the firm and helps it in turn to produce the goods and services in an optimal manner. So the better the quality of entrepreneurship, the more efficiently and the better the quality of the goods and services produced, right? And you can well imagine that the stock of entrepreneurs in an economy is also limited, and their skills are limited as well. So we've established that all the four factors of production, in fact, are limited: land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. What implication does this have for what we were studying earlier, i.e. the slide? I'm referring to the slide. There we saw that human wants, like what the households want to consume, that stock of wants is unlimited. But the goods and services that firms are producing in order to meet those wants are limited, because the factors of production which are used to produce those goods and services are limited. This creates the main economic problem of scarcity. And most of economics is involved in trying to understand this question better and then solve it in an optimal way. So now let's take a hypothetical example. Let's imagine that you played a lottery. You bought a lottery ticket and you won a lottery, $1 million or £1 million or crores of rupees. Would the problem of scarcity, would the economic problem of scarcity be solved? Well, at some level you'll say, well, if I won a lottery, my problem of poverty is solved, right? I can now buy as many cars as I want to. I can now buy more houses, more televisions, more computers. Fine. But is the problem of scarcity, which was at the heart of economics, is that solved? Not quite. Because no matter how much money you have, the number of goods and services that you can still consume is limited. And that limitation comes from the limitedness of the factors of production: land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Thus, the problem of scarcity is not something that can go away by printing more money or giving more money to one person. In fact, it can be exacerbated. The more money you have, the more your task of choosing which goods and services to consume becomes more difficult, right? Limited stocks of goods and services, and you have more money to spend on those, then your task becomes actually more difficult on which good to consume, which not to consume, and stuff like that. So that is one dimension of scarcity. There is also another dimension, which is that when you have scarce factors of production: land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship, who decides what those factors will be devoted to, like the production of? Like whether you will use your land to construct buildings or whether you will use your land to grow crops. Whose needs or whose wants will you satisfy given those limited stock of land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship, right? So, for example, you might have rich people in the country who want to consume Rolls Royces or Mercedes-Benz cars or private jets, whereas there are poor people in the economy who want to have more bicycles or more rickshaws. So who decides as to what the land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship will be devoted to producing? This is where the role of government comes in. While the government is not the sole institution which is responsible for distributing or determining this rationing of resources, it does play an important part, right? In fact, what the optimal role of government should be in determining how to ration resources and goods and services is the question which economists have concerned themselves with most in the last 2-3 centuries. We had Adam Smith and the classical economists who believed that the government should have no role in allocating resources or in rationing goods and services. Then we had socialist influences in economics, which would put forward the idea of planned economies, in which the government had a very strong role. And now we are again moving towards some kind of a market economy in which the government has little role to play, but it's not the extreme right to which the classicals belong to. So let's take this issue of what the optimal role of government should be in rationing or distribution of resources in any economy. Before we look at this question, it's important to recognize that any government should aim at producing the optimal mix of goods and services in the economy, or what it considers the optimal mix. It should not be a mix of goods and services which satisfies the wants of only a few people in the economy. It should be a mix of goods and services which satisfies the maximum possible number of people's wants or households' wants in the economy. That is what would categorize as an optimal mix of resources. Now, economists have presented 3 different ideas as to how the government should play a role in determining this optimal mix of resources. We have dictatorship. In a dictatorship, the idea is that you have a group of people, powerful people or clever people, but a group of few people, or it could be one person, in which case it could be a benevolent dictator, who determines or who decides how the goods, which goods, and for whom the goods are going to be produced in the economy. So nobody has any other say in this particular decision. It's that group, that select group, which decides what to produce, who will produce it, and in what quantity to produce. Now, obviously, you can see that in a world in which the benefits of democracy and some kind of representative government are recognized, it is very difficult to conceive of an economy in which dictatorship will be acceptable, or any kind of dictatorship will be acceptable. So this form of government, while it remains as one of the options, is not the rationing possibility which is widely accepted by economists. What's the second one? The second one is command economy. What is a command economy? A command economy, or another term for that, is a planned economy. In a planned economy, it is the central government, the state, which is responsible fully for determining the optimal mix of resources and goods and services in the economy. So the government sits down, thinks about what the optimal mix of goods and services is, then decides how the factors of production need to be deployed in order to produce that optimal mix of goods and services. A natural question arises: how does the government know what the optimal mix is? Well, in order to do that, the government usually, sort of in this kind of a setup, relies on the principles of equity and broad popular desire or preferences. So if a large segment of the population is, let's say, is involved in farming, then the government would naturally have a bent or a preference towards producing the goods and services that are demanded more by farmers, right? What are the main criticisms of such a system? We saw that dictatorship was not tenable in a world which recognizes the benefits of democracy. So what are the key arguments against a command economy? Now, the problem with a command economy is that it gives perhaps too much power to the state. That's one. And once you have state officials or government officials with all the power to decide the fate of millions of people, then that naturally creates an incentive for corruption. And many of the command economies that existed in the 20th century, starting with the Soviet Union, China, other countries, we'll come to that in a short while, did suffer from this problem of corruption. That state officials, because they had this immense power, were susceptible to the incentives of corruption and rent-seeking. The other criticism which is leveled against command economies is that if there is a change in circumstances or the environment, the economic environment in which we are operating, the state or the government is not able to respond as fast as perhaps some other mechanism would be able to respond. So, for example, think of a hypothetical situation in which the government decided that the optimal mix of goods in the economy was, let's say, 5 apples and 4 cars. Right? Let's say there are just these 2 goods that the economy can produce and just these 2 goods that consumers demand. So it's 5 apples and 4 cars. But suddenly, let's say the preferences of consumers change and they want to demand, they demand more apples and less cars. So that the new optimal mix of goods is 6 apples and 1 car. Right? Now, the optimality of the system would arise if the government could immediately shift resources so as to produce the new optimal mix of goods, like the new combination of apples and cars, right? But it has been recognized that the government is usually much slower than other mechanisms in implementing this shift. And this is the second major criticism of command economies, so that the economy can actually get stuck in a suboptimal state or a state in which a suboptimal mix of goods is being produced for a long, long time. And this is inefficient, economically inefficient. The final alternative, and perhaps the most popular one, that economists have put forward for how resources should be allocated or rationed in an economy is that of the market system, the market economy, which uses price as the rationing device. How does this work? The way it works is that producers, firms, charge the highest price that they can get for their goods, right? So if they charge a certain price, let's say there's a producer of apples, right? He produces apples and then charges a price of 5 rupees per apple. Now, if the consumers consider that this price is too high, they will not demand those apples, and the producer will be unable to sell those apples. So by looking at whether a particular price generates excess demand or excess supply, the producer gets a hint of what he should do to his price. So if he is not able to sell his apples, that means that there is an excess supply in the market, and therefore he needs to reduce his price. The argument that the supporters of the free market system present is that the price mechanism works very fast. So as soon as the producer sets a price and notes what the market's response is to that, consumers' response is to that, he immediately gets the hint that he has to reduce his price. So that at any point, the price is prevailing, and hence the goods and services which are being produced align with the optimal mix of goods and services at that particular time. Right? So this is the main argument put forward in favor of a free market system. That's one advantage. The other advantage is that under a pure market economy, there is no role for the government. The market itself is sufficient to determine how goods and services will be produced, in what quantities they will be produced, and for whom they will be produced. Right? So there's no role for government, and all the arguments that are leveled against strong governments like corruption, nepotism, slow response, inefficiency, all of those disappear. The market is self-sufficient and the market is efficient. That's for the market economy. The key criticism against the market economy is that often it pays no attention to concerns of equity or equality of income distribution. So if a particular distribution of goods and services favors the very rich, and if that is what the market decides, then that's what the economy gets. So if the poor people desire something else, but the market wants the economy to produce Rolls Royces and the poor people want bicycles, then the poor would not get those bicycles because the market has decided that Rolls Royces is what should be produced. So this is the key argument against market economies. So dear students, we've discussed the three different types of economic systems that economists have put forward. Dictatorship, command economy, and the free market economy. And we've discussed the arguments for and the arguments against. The next question is there a consensus of economists or of people generally as to which system is more preferable? The answer to that question is not simple. Different governments, different people have different preferences. They have experimented with different systems at different points in their history and have had very different results. One way to approach this question as to which of these three systems is more desirable is to look at how different economies in the world are set up, whether they are market economies or whether they are command economies. So let's refer to a slide which will show us how different economies are laid upon this spectrum of economic systems. At one end you have the free market, at the other end you have the command economy. So let's take a look at our slide. So dear students, as you can see, we have a number of countries which are placed at different points in this line. At one end of the line we have totally free market economy, and at the other end you have the totally planned economy. Now, countries like Hong Kong, which is in East Asia, is one example of a country which is very close to the free market description that we just went through. Then we have countries like the United States of America, which some of you might have expected to be at the extreme right, but as you can see, it is not at the extreme right. It is less of a free market economy than Hong Kong, and which is also consistent with fact, because the US government, although it is not as active as let's say the government in China or Russia, does still have a role to play in tax policy and in monetary policy and other realms of economic policy. Two other interesting things that this slide contains is that how countries have had different systems or evolved their systems over time. So look at Poland, for example. Poland was a country which was towards the planned side of the spectrum. This was before the breakup of the Soviet Union. Poland was under the influence of socialist policies. So in the mid-1970s, you can see Poland as a country which practiced a command economy, a predominantly command economy. But then it has undergone a transition in the 1980s, and come the mid-90s, we see Poland bang in the middle of the spectrum, so that it's still transitioning from a totally planned economy to a free market economy, but that it has covered substantial ground and it's moving towards the right end of the spectrum. Another example is China. Although China's movement from the left side to the right is slower than that of Poland. Interestingly, one common trend that we can notice is that there is no country here which has moved from right to left from 1970s to the mid-1990s. So all of the countries, if you compare the USA in the 1970s, it has also moved to the right in the 1990s. Take Hong Kong, it has also moved to the right. UK, it has also moved to the right. France, China, Poland, North Korea. So that shows that there is a general preference for the free market economy, which is now coming to be accepted across the world. So now an interesting question would be, where does Pakistan fit in on this line, this continuum of economic systems? Well, one can surely say that Pakistan started out as a relatively pro-market, pro-free market economy, so that in the 1960s, when we had the Ayub era, prices were independently decided by the private sector. Government interference in the economy was quite limited, and so it's natural to expect that Pakistan would have been somewhere close to where the U.S. is. The U.S. was in the 1970s. Then come the 1970s in Pakistan, we had the policies of nationalization and some kind of socialist bent in economic policies that the Bhutto era brought, and Pakistan moved to the left of the spectrum. So we might have moved to somewhere where China was in the 1970s, or maybe Poland. And now again, after the experiment with nationalization and socialist policies did not prove successful, we've begun moving towards the right again. And throughout the late 80s and early 90s, we've shown a consistent movement towards the right side of the spectrum. So we're somewhere close to where the UK or the US, somewhere between the UK and the US in the 1990s. So this diagram, this slide gives a very good idea of how different countries have experimented with different economic systems and how they have evolved over time. Broadly, the conclusion from this slide is that there has been an increasing preference for the free market economy vis-a-vis the planned economy, and this is mainly because of the criticisms against the planned economy, the criticisms that the state becomes corrupt and that the state is slow to respond to changes in economic circumstances. And these two problems, which have quite enormous implications for economic efficiency, are not existent in a free market economy in which the market decides at all times what the mix of goods and services is to be produced. Now, this long discussion that we've had about the different economic systems that countries can have might have prompted some of you to think as to whether this is what we are discussing is in the realm of microeconomics or macroeconomics. Remember, I promised to define these two terms at the beginning of the lecture because this is a crucial distinction in economics. In order to illustrate what the distinction between micro and macroeconomics is, let's make use of a slide in which we will think about how incomes flow within the economy, how goods and services flow within the economy, and then how microeconomic concepts and macroeconomic concepts integrate. Let's refer to the slide. Now, here is a diagram which illustrates the circular flow of goods and incomes in any economy. You might recall we noted earlier that the process of satisfying human wants involves producers and consumers. Now, the relationship between them is two-sided, and this is exactly what this diagram is capturing. The consumers of goods and services are households, as we saw earlier. Some members of households, of course, are also workers. Actually, this is an important point which I probably should have mentioned earlier, that households, while they are consuming, can also be producers. So think of a person who works in a factory in the mornings. Now, if he's working in a factory and chewing a chewing gum, he is at that particular time a consumer. He is consuming the chewing gum, and he is at that same time a producer because he's helping to produce some good. So workers can at the same time be consumers and producers. Also, in some cases, they can be the owners of other factors of production, such as land. So while you work in a factory in the mornings, you come home and then you have land of your own where you have your house and own your own place. So workers and households are interconnected in a very, very strong way. The producers of goods and services are, of course, labeled as firms. Now, firms and households are in a twin demand and supply relationship with each other. And we'll illustrate why they are these twin demand and supply relationships and not just one. First, notice that on the right-hand side of the diagram, households demand goods and services, and firms supply goods and services. In the process, exchange takes place. In a money economy, as opposed to a barter economy, and I'll explain what a barter economy is in a short while. So in a money economy, firms exchange goods and services for money. In other words, money flows from households to firms in the form of consumer expenditure, while goods and services flow the other way, from firms to households. Now, in a barter economy, or a barter economy is one in which people exchange goods and services directly with one another without any payment of money. So workers would be paid with bundles of goods instead of money wages. So that's the difference between a barter economy and a money economy. Now, sticking with the money economy, let's get back to this exchange that we talked about of goods and services for money. Now, this coming together of buyers and sellers in the goods and services market is known as a market, whether it be a street market, a shop, an auction, or whatever. Thus, we talk about the market for apples, the market for oil, for cars, for houses, for televisions, for computers, and so on. Secondly, firms and households come together in the market for factors of production. Now, this is crucial, and this is where the twin demand and supply relationship comes in. This is illustrated on the left-hand side of the diagram. This time, the demand and supply roles are reversed. Remember that earlier, it was firms who were supplying the goods and services, and households which were demanding the goods and services. Now we have firms who demand the use of factors of production which are owned by households, i.e. land, labor, and capital. Households supply these factors. Thus, the services of labor and other factors flow from households to firms, and in exchange, firms pay households money, namely wages, rent, dividends, and interest. Now, wages is the return that is paid for the supply of labor. Rent is the return which is paid for the supply of, yes, land. And dividends is the return which is paid for the supply of, yes, entrepreneurship. And interest is the return which is paid for the supply of capital. So just as we referred to particular goods markets, we can also refer to particular factor markets. There is thus, as you can see, a circular flow of incomes. Households earn incomes from firms, and firms earn incomes from households. The money circulates. There is also a circular flow of goods and services, but in the opposite direction. Households supply factor services to firms, who then use them to supply goods and services back to households. This flow diagram can help to show the distinction between microeconomics and macroeconomics. You must be wondering how. Well, look at it like this. Microeconomics is concerned with the composition of the circular flow, i.e. what combinations of goods make up the goods flow, how the various factors of production are combined to produce these goods, for whom the wages, dividends, rent, and interest are paid out. These are all microeconomic issues. They are called microeconomic because they deal with individual product markets, individual households, individual firms, and how they behave in an economy. Macroeconomics, on the other hand, is concerned with the total size of the flow and what causes it to expand and contract. So macro, which means big, is basically concerned with the aggregate behavior of firms and households in the economy and how different factors cause this aggregate flow of resources and of money to expand and contract, and hence we have issues of unemployment, inflation, different recessionary phases in the economy, booms, busts, exchange rates, and then we'll talk about further issues which come under macroeconomics later on. So with that, we conclude the discussion for this particular lecture. Let's now evaluate what we've learned in this lecture. So let's now try to sum up. You might remember that we started with a discussion of how economics needs to be approached in the first place. We recognize that economics is a social science. It is not a natural science. And we mentioned that there are two major differences between the study of social sciences and the study of natural sciences. One was the absence of controlled environments, the absence of laboratory environments for conducting experiments. In the social sciences, you do not have controlled environments, and all the factors affecting a particular variable still remain there, and therefore it's difficult to isolate individual relationships between two variables. We also mentioned that social sciences involve a study of human behavior, and that human behavior can never be accurately depicted. whatever you say about human behavior is bound to be an approximation. It can be a good approximation, it can be a bad approximation, but it will remain an approximation. We then went on to discuss two important questions about economics. One, how economics was defined, and two, why it was important to study economics. On the second question, we noticed that all of us are surrounded by economic phenomena and issues. So we have news about unemployment, inflation, prices, exports, poverty, drilled into our ears on a daily basis. So as responsible citizens of society, it is important that we develop a basic knowledge of economic concepts so that we can develop informed views and opinions about these important matters. Without a knowledge of economics, we can have ideas about these things or subjective judgments about these, but they would not be informed or objective. The second question was, how should we define economics? And the definition that I put forward was that economics is a study of how we, the people, engage ourselves in the production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services in society. Right? And then we went on to dissect this definition and look at each of the individual terms that we used. So we talked about the difference between goods and services. We talked about what was involved in consumption, in production, in distribution. And then most importantly, we saw how we was divided, we the people. So we saw that we could be households, we could be firms involved in production, and we could be part of the government involved in distribution and allocation. So we then noticed two important things about this division of we the people. We noticed that as consumers, we generate demand for goods and services, and as producers, as firms, we produce those goods and services using factors of production. And that took us to the question of scarcity in economics, which formulates the basic economic problem. The problem of scarcity was defined as the excess of human wants over what could be produced to fulfill those wants or satisfy those wants. And we noted that firms use scarce factors of production to produce a certain mix of goods. And we defined the factors of production as 1, labor, 2, capital, 3, land, and 4, entrepreneurship. And we noted that each of these factors was scarce. So you had limited land, limited labor supply, a limited stock of capital, and limited stock of entrepreneurships or entrepreneurial skills. And that naturally gave birth to the problem of scarcity, in that there is a limited quantity of goods and services that you can produce, but wants about those goods and services are bound to be unlimited. So whether you have a very rich person or a very poor person, both of them have unlimited wants. The person who has 2 houses wants another house. The person who doesn't have a house wants a first house. So there is no end to what human beings can want. But there is a restriction on the amount that the economy can produce. Now, once we have the situation in which wants are unlimited and goods are limited, then there is obviously a rationale for rationing. And then we went on to discuss how economists had put forward different ways in which goods and services could be rationed. So we introduced 3 different rationing possibilities. We introduced dictatorship, in which a few people decide how rationing would be done. We introduced the concept of the command economy, which is inspired by socialist thinking, in which the central government decides, based on popular desire, on the demands of the larger section of the population, and on the principles of equity, on how goods and services were to be produced, which of those were to be produced, and how factors of production were to be deployed to produce that optimal mix of goods and services. And then finally we introduced the market economy, which allows the price system to ration goods and services in the economy. We discussed the pros and cons of these 3 systems, and then we saw how different countries in the real world had adopted these different systems and how their systems had evolved over time. And through this discussion, we saw that over time, the preference for the free market system has increased. Countries which had socialist policies or which leaned towards the planned or command economy are now leaning towards the free market economy. and that was the general preference in economics that we talked about. Finally, in the last part of the lecture, we illustrated the distinction between microeconomics and macroeconomics using the circular flow of goods and services, goods and incomes. We saw how firms and households were caught in a twin demand and supply relationship, where firms demand factors of production from households supply those factors, and where households demand goods and services from firms, and firms produce those goods and services using the factors of production supplied by the households. And we saw that microeconomics was concerned with what was the structure of that flow, what goods were being produced and for whom, whereas macroeconomics was at an aggregate level concerned with what was the total size of that flow, whether it was contracting, expanding, and what factors made it contract and expand. With this, my dear students, we have concluded today's lecture. In lecture number 2, we will take the distinction between microeconomics and macroeconomics forward. We will look at two fundamental concepts in economics, that of rational choices and of opportunity cost. They are both interlinked, and we'll see how that can be used to take the distinction between microeconomics and macroeconomics further. I hope you've enjoyed today's lecture, and I hope that you're looking forward to the next one, and that you go home, look at the lecture notes, and practice the questions that have been put up for you on the web. Assalamu alaikum and Khuda Hafiz.